Welcome back to the Tree of Discernment, friends.
Mm.
Today, we're diving into the world before the flood,
Oh, yeah.
and not just the flood itself,
Right.
but what it must have been like to live alongside the Nephilim.
Yeah, the flood gets a lot of attention,
Right.
and understandably so. But I think sometimes we skim over what it must have been like for people just trying to live ordinary lives with these giants walking the earth.
Exactly. How do you even begin to wrap your head around that? We're talking about the offspring of fallen angels and humans,
Right.
beings of immense power, maybe even cannibalistic, according to some ancient texts.
Yeah.
That's not your average neighborhood bully.
No, not at all. It's like trying to picture a world where run for the hills wasn't just a saying, it was a survival strategy.
Okay, so let's get practical. If you're living in that world, what are your options? I mean, how do you even start to defend yourself against something like that?
Well, you'd think shelter, right. But we're not talking about hiding under a bed. Imagine entire cities built like fortresses. Not just a wall, but layers of walls.
hmm
Maybe even strategically placed in mountainous areas for extra protection.
So you're picturing something almost like a biblical city on a hill.
Yeah, but less about the moral high ground and more about don't come up here if you're a giant kind of high ground. Like a real life Attack on Titan situation, but with maybe less stylish gear.
I love that you brought up Attack on Titan. It's almost eerie how some of those ancient stories seem to foreshadow our own pop culture fascinations, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, well, walls are passive, right?
Mm-hmm.
What about fighting back? Surely they didn't just cower behind walls forever.
Right. Specialized warrior groups trained from childhood to combat these giants. They would have to know everything about giant anatomy, weaknesses, maybe even developing special tactics and weaponry.
Whoa, hold on. We're talking Bronze Age, right?
Yeah.
What kind of special weaponry could they possibly have created that would even make a dent against a giant?
That's where things get really fascinating. We have these ancient texts that talk about fallen angels sharing knowledge with humans.
Okay.
Things like metallurgy, advanced craftsmanship, who knows what else.
Wait, so you're saying that some of the technology that they might have had access to could have been, how do I put this, angelically inspired? I mean, that's kind of blowing my mind right now. Are we talking like giant slaying ballistic or something?
It's not impossible. We know humans were capable of building incredible things even back then.
Right.
Imagine those skills enhanced with knowledge that was, shall we say, out of this world.
Yeah.
It's tantalizing to think about what they might have been capable of, maybe
Right.
even something like early mechanical weaponry.
All right. You've officially sent my imagination into overdrive now.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got fortified cities, elite warriors, maybe even some divinely inspired tech. But are we really saying that's all they had to work with? I mean, these were beings with potentially supernatural powers.
Mm-hmm.
Did they ever try to fight fire with fire?
That's a really interesting point, and honestly, that's where we have to start thinking a little less military strategy and a little more spiritually.
Okay, now we're getting into the real meat of things. What does that look like? Were they chanting around campfires, drawing protective sigils?
Imagine rituals, blessings, maybe even entire systems of spiritual practices designed to ward off or weaken these giants. It's like a spiritual parallel to those massive walls,
Yeah.
creating barriers in the unseen realm.
You know, it's funny. We still do things like that today, even if we don't always realize it. Like wearing a mezuzah on our doorpost or saying a prayer for protection.
Absolutely. It's a very human impulse to seek protection beyond the physical.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Cities as fortresses, elite warriors, and even spiritual warfare. But something tells me we're just scratching the surface here. This is the pre-flood world after all. And I have a feeling things are about to get a whole lot more complicated.
Yeah, it's easy to focus on the more action movie aspects of it all.
Right.
But I think we'd be remiss if we didn't consider the toll this must take on people's psyches.
Right.
Living under the constant threat of these giants, knowing their power, the sheer terror, it must have been utterly draining.
It makes you wonder how far people would go just to feel safe, even for a little while.
Exactly. And that brings us to a less glamorous, but perhaps even more intriguing aspect of this whole scenario: appeasement.
Appeasement. Like trying to make peace with these giants. Offering them gifts. I can't imagine that going well.
Well, maybe gifts in the beginning, sure. But
Yeah.
we're probably talking about something far more disturbing, even heartbreaking sacrifices.
You're not suggesting human sacrifices, are you?
It's a grim thought, but
Yeah.
it's not entirely outside the realm of possibility. Desperate times often lead to desperate measures. Imagine a community terrified and desperate to protect their loved ones, convinced that this is the only way to keep the giants at bay.
It's just such a heavy burden to bear to make that kind of choice. This isn't just about fighting a physical enemy anymore. It's about grappling with moral dilemmas that would tear a society apart. I mean, how do you come back from something like that?
It speaks to the depth of their fear and desperation, and it also raises the question, if they were willing to go that far, what other compromises might they have made?
Well, earlier you mentioned the possibility of alliances with other spiritual beings. Could
Uh-huh.
that have been another path they took, maybe as an alternative to these darker forms of appeasement?
It's definitely a possibility. If you're dealing with a threat from one group of powerful beings, aligning yourself with another, even if it's risky, might seem like a logical option.
But wouldn't that be like trading one danger for another? I mean, who knows what those other beings might demand in return?
Absolutely. But remember, we're not talking about a world where people had a lot of good options.
Right.
And some ancient texts suggest that not all spiritual beings were inherently evil. Some might have seen an opportunity to gain influence, to be worshipped as gods in exchange for protection against the Nephilim.
So you're suggesting that in this world, humans might have been making deals with, let's call them lesser evils, to survive.
It's a chilling thought, but it fits with the picture we're building here. A world where survival meant navigating a complex web of alliances, compromises, and constant threats. And it also makes you wonder about the long-term consequences of those choices. What happens when you make a deal with a being that might have its own agenda?
Yeah, that's what always gets me about these stories. It's not just the immediate danger that's fascinating. It's those ripples that carry on for generations.
Yeah.
It's like the biblical story of Jacob wrestling with the angel that encounter changed him forever. I wonder if those who made deals with these beings were ever truly the same again.
That's a profound point. It raises the question of what it really means to be human, especially in a world where the lines between the physical and spiritual are so blurred. Are you still fully human if you've given a part of yourself, a part of your soul to something else?
It's giving me chills just thinking about it.
Yeah.
But it also makes me appreciate how these stories, even the ones that might seem fantastical or allegorical, can resonate with us on such a deep level.
Because at the end of the day, they're not just about giants and floods. They're about the very nature of good and evil, choice and consequence, and what it means to be human in a world that often feels beyond our control.
And that idea of control or lack thereof is something that seems to echo throughout these stories.
Yeah.
We talked about walls, physical and spiritual, as a way to create a sense of safety. But I'm struck by how many of the strategies we've discussed involve, in a way, giving up control. Appeasement alliances, it's almost like a desperate attempt to find some semblance of order in a world that feels chaotic.
You've hit on something really important there. The need for control is such a fundamental human drive. And when we're faced with something that threatens that control, something as terrifying and incomprehensible as these giants, it's natural to seek it out in whatever way we can, even if it means making compromises that might haunt us later.
I think that's a theme we see throughout human history, isn't it? The struggle to reconcile our desire for control with the often unpredictable nature of the world around us.
And it's fascinating to see how these ancient stories grapple with those very same questions, offering insights that are just as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago.
Speaking of those ancient stories, you know what keeps popping up for me? The image of walls. Walls as protection walls, as boundaries. Walls as symbols of both strength and vulnerability. It's not just in the Bible, it's in mythologies from all over the world.
It's like a universal archetype. Think about the walls of Jericho, the walls of Asgard in Norse mythology, the Great Wall of China. They all speak to this deep-seated human fear of the unknown, of forces that feel larger than ourselves, and the need to create barriers for protection.
And maybe it's not just about physical protection. Maybe it's also about creating a sense of order, of separating the known from the unknown, the safe from the dangerous.
You're right, walls can be psychological as much as physical. They represent the boundaries we draw to define our world, to make sense of it, and to feel safe within those boundaries.
But here's the thing, walls can be breached. They can crumble. And that's what makes me wonder what happened when those defenses failed. What did people do when they were faced with the raw, terrifying reality of these giants with no walls to hide behind?
That's where things get even more intriguing, because despite the fear, despite the unimaginable odds, the human spirit is incredibly resilient. And I think that's what these stories ultimately teach us, that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there's always the potential for courage, ingenuity, and even, dare I say, hope. And that's the beauty of it, isn't it? These stories, these ancient echoes, they keep whispering to us across the centuries, inviting us to look closer, to dig deeper, to find those connections that link us to the past and illuminate our present.
It's almost like those ancient storytellers were planting seeds, knowing that they would bloom generations later, offering insights that would resonate even in a world vastly different from their own.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this whole discussion so compelling. We're not just talking about history, we're talking about the human condition. The same fears, hopes, struggles, they keep recurring, echoing across time.
Okay, I have to ask, because I know our listeners are thinking it too, what echoes are we seeing today? I mean, we're not building walls to keep out literal giants, but are there any parallels we can draw to our modern world?
Absolutely. Think about it. We still build walls. Maybe not always with stone and mortar, but with borders, with ideologies, with social structures. We create these boundaries to define ourselves, to protect ourselves, to feel safe.
It's like that primal need for security never really goes away, does it? We might be more sophisticated in our methods, but the underlying motivation is the same, to create a sense of order in a world that often feels chaotic.
And just like those ancient civilizations, we also grapple with forces that feel larger than ourselves. Social injustice, economic hardship, political turmoil, even the looming threat of climate change. They all have that element of giant to them, don't they?
Wow, when you put it that way, it really does make you realize that we're not so different from those who came before us. We're still fighting our own battles against giants, just in different forms.
Exactly. And just like them, we have to be resourceful, courageous, and maybe even a little bit cunning to overcome these challenges. And maybe, just maybe, we can learn a thing or two from their strategies, both the successful ones and the ones that went terribly wrong.
So what you're saying is that these ancient stories, they're not just entertainment or even just history. They're a source of wisdom we can tap into to navigate the challenges of our own time.
Precisely. They offer us a different lens through which to view our own world. A reminder that the human spirit has been wrestling with these questions, these dilemmas, for a very long time. And that in itself is a source of both comfort and inspiration.
Comfort in knowing we're not alone in these struggles, and inspiration to rise to the occasion, to find our own strength, our own resilience, our own faith, to face whatever giants might be looming on our horizon.
Beautifully put. And I think that's a perfect place to wrap up this deep dive. We've explored the physical and spiritual challenges of coexisting with the Nephilim, the desperate strategies they employed, the moral compromises they faced, and ultimately the enduring lessons we can glean from their experiences.
It's been a journey, that's for sure. From towering walls and elite warriors to spiritual warfare and uneasy alliances, we've covered a lot of ground. But more importantly, I think we've uncovered a depth of human experience that transcends time itself.
And I hope our listeners will continue to explore these topics, to ponder the mysteries, to draw their own conclusions, and to see how these ancient echoes resonate in their own lives.
Because that's the real power of these stories, isn't it? They invite us to keep digging, keep questioning, keep the conversation going, and in doing so, to deepen our understanding of ourselves, our world, and the forces that shape both.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the pre-flood world. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and may you find strength, wisdom, and hope in the ancient echoes that continue to whisper across the ages.